Hello, everyone. My name is Rio. I will be walking us through the English section of this ACT 498. I am the director of the Humanities Department here at Hamilton Education. So all the reading, all the writing, English on the SAT, ACT, all that stuff, uh, I basically run that here at the company. So you may have seen me teaching a class that you were in. You may have me as a tutor, or you may be meeting me just now as a test review in this test review video. But either way, know that you've been interacting with my stuff for some time. So with this test review video, we're going to go through every single question of this English section of ACT 498. We're going to talk about why the question is difficult, why it might be easy, why the correct answer is correct, why the incorrect answer is incorrect. So we're going to go into depth. And I'm also going to try to make sure that with each question, I give you some tips and tricks as to how to navigate these questions in future instances as well. So with that, I'm just going to move on to our questions. But thank you for joining us, and I hope that you'll find this useful. Okay, so question one is a question asking us about verb tense. All right, so if you're missing a question like question one, I want to make sure that you are looking around in the rest of the text in order to get the correct answer. So here in the same sentence, we see are, right? Conjugating forms. Okay, so forms is plural. That means we're going to use a plural verb, are, and are is in the present tense. All right, so that means we're going to want an answer choice that is in the present tense and goes with our proper number with the noun of the genre, genre being singular, and is does that perfectly. Okay, so why can't we delete this? Well, if we delete it, we lose the verb for the sentence, the predicate, so the second independent clause in the sentence wouldn't work. A and B both are incorrect because these two answer choices make the second clause a dependent clause. But it's not a dependent clause. It needs to be an independent clause. Why do we know? Well, we're connecting it with a fanboys conjunction over here and a comma, one of our for and nor but or yet so. So we know that this clause needs to be independent. So with that, we arrive to C here. For question one, we're just going to use the simple present tense, singular, just like we see up here. We're using the simple present tense, plural, because we just have a different subject between the two parts of this compound, meaning there's two independent clauses, sentence. All right, so question two is what we call a non-essential phrase. So if you missed question two, I need you to write down in your notes somewhere you need to identify to yourself that non-essential phrases are something you need to work with. Okay, so what is a non-essential phrase? A non-essential phrase is a piece of a sentence that doesn't need to be in the sentence, but we like to have there nonetheless. Okay, how do we know it doesn't need to be there? Well, because the clause in which it is embedded functions without that little piece. So you put it between the non-essential phrase is always going to come between a pair of punctuation. So in answer choice C, we see it in a pair of commas. It can be in a pair of commas, a pair of dashes, or a pair of parentheses, right? So a pair of commas is all good. Now, when you take it out, does the sentence still work? Yes. Singers often produce nonsense syllables to represent specific instrumental sounds, right? That's a perfectly functioning clause on its own. Now, you might want to know what these syllables are called. They're called vocables, right? You put that in a non-essential phrase, it's in a positive in that it explains directly the noun that comes right before it. Okay, so B, we're missing the comma before the non-essential phrase. A, we're missing the comma after. In D, we have an extra comma here that we don't need. So we have a reason for why A, B, and D are all wrong. We know that we're doing non-essential phrases here. That's how we arrive to C. If you miss this, make sure you're studying those non-essential phrases. All right, so three is kind of interesting, right? We have all these different forms of easy. So why are some of these wrong, but some of these are right? So when we read the sentence, the results are songs that rarely make literal sense, but nevertheless flow in a way that we can dance to, right? So First things first, why is easier wrong? Easier is wrong is because it suggests a comparison. All right. Easier is a comparative word. It's in a comparative form. It is easier than what, you might be asking. So if you chose A, while easier kind of sounds fine, it isn't correct because there is no comparison being made here. Um, Now, if we delete the portion, we now know we are now are losing some of our precision and concision, right? Or precision and clarity. Um, what, they've flown away to dance to, we're losing some of the meaning of this sentence by getting rid of it. Now, um, finally, uh, easily versus that is easy. We have to choose that is easy because we have this in a way there. All right, in a way, easily to dance to doesn't make any sense, obviously. I think that that is one of those ones where just follow your ears. Okay, so we want to follow our ears to guide us to our initial thoughts, but we don't want to rely solely on our ears. I think A is an example of where if you rely solely on your ears and you don't apply a more rigorous perspective, you might choose A and be wrong because easier sounds okay until you realize, oh, there's no comparison going on here. But in a way, easily to dance to doesn't make any sense, right? Um, so easily would need to have some sort of subject allowing it to work that we can easily dance with or something like that. So because there is no pronoun subject that allows for easily, we're going to just go with that is easy. Makes perfect sense. You read the whole sentence. The results are songs that rarely make literal sense, but nevertheless flow in a way that is easy to dance to. Perfectly good. If you missed this, I presume you chose easier, in which case just make sure you're understanding what easier actually does, rather than solely relying on the ear test. Okay, so 4 asks us if we were to delete the underlined portion, right, or in your text, I might say the highlighted portion, the sentence would lose something. Okay, so whether it says highlighted or regardless, we know that what we're looking at is the words often tongue twisting. Okay. Um, so why do we need that there? What would be gone if we got rid of it? Well, the lyrics require much practice to perfect. If we don't know that they're tongue twisting, we might not know why they are hard to perfect. Okay, we might not know why we need to practice them so much, right? It could be that the lyrics are so slow, it would be hard to do. Or that there are just so many words, it would be difficult to memorize them all, right? But understanding that they are tongue twisting, meaning that the syllables or something like that is difficult, demonstrates why exactly they do require a lot of practice to perfect it. Okay. Do we learn anything more about the writing of the lyrics for these portables? I'm assuming that's how we pronounce that. No, right. Do we learn a little bit more about how they are performed in Celtic culture by saying often tongue twisting? No. And then finally, um, is tongue twisting a training exercise? No. Okay, so there's something wrong with all these other ones, which is how we can arrive to A for question 4. All right, so question 5 is a transitions question. We are asked which transition makes most sense. All right, so we have to understand the relationship between the two sentences next to each other, right? So first sentence shows off what requires a lot of practice, which is tongue twisting lyrics. The next sentence says that even if tongue twisting lyrics requires a lot of even if the tongue twisting lyrics requires a lot of practice, the harder thing, the even harder thing, is learning when to breathe, right? So the breathing is the hardest part of this, actually. So we want a pivoting transition, okay? So though functions like a however in this case. It is the perfect kind of transitioning word that shows a contrast to say, hey, even though the tongue twisting lyrics are something that require a lot of practice, the even harder thing to do is learning when to breathe. So that's how we arrive to A for question 5. At the same time, would mean that uh, they're equal or equivalent challenges. Are they happening at the same time? No. C would mean that there's something of an exception, which doesn't make sense. And then still would be okay in a different place, perhaps. Still, the greatest challenge is actually this. But we need a word like actually there, which would function as our pivoting transition. Okay, so A is the only one that works in its place. It is the most logical transition we could use here, this pivot. So question 6 is asking which of the following statements would most effectively introduce the subject of the paragraph? So if you missed this question, I'm worried that what you probably did is that you just didn't really understand the question stem, and rather you put an answer choice that just sounded good. But here's the thing. All of these answer choices sound perfectly fine. All of these answer choices could be true, right? Or are they all true? They are all true. We're not looking to put something that is the most interesting sounding or quote unquote sounds the best, has the best flow, to use language that my students use all the time that doesn't really mean anything. Rather, what we're looking for is what is the subject of this sentence and which answer choice reveals that? Okay, well, A is best because we're talking all about why did we make this music that makes fake instrument noises? Well, because instruments were really, really expensive, right? And because there was a lot of illiteracy, it gave an opportunity to learn and pass on songs, even if you couldn't read music. So uh, people wanted to dance and listen to music, but if there wasn't enough money to buy an instrument, might as well make the sound of that instrument with your mouth. All right, B could be true, but does this paragraph here have anything to do with rhythm? Not directly, right? C, that might be true, but does this paragraph have anything to do with the influence of math music? No. And finally, D, is the walking song talked about at all in this paragraph? No, right? We're focusing solely on mouth music and the reason why it seemed to come into existence. So if you missed question 6, is that I don't think you read the question stem. All right, so make sure you're really focused on the question stem for a question like 6, these rhetoric questions on the ACT. 7 is a really perfect example of a question that I would say is not hard, but is really easy to miss. I feel like a question like 7 is one that I see most often on the SAT, even though we're actually in the ACT right now. But nonetheless, it is something we see on the ACT too. All right. Why is this something that is easy ultimately? Well, if it was written like C in the get-go, right, it wouldn't be confusing, right? Instruments were prohibitively expensive and thus scarce in isolated Scottish villages. In order to fill the void, mouth music emerged and provided residents with the music they wanted for dancing. It's really clear why C is correct. We have two independent clauses next to each other, and our options to combine two independent clauses are with either a period, a semicolon, or a comma and a fan voice combo, right? And of course, D is wrong because it's just the comma. That's a comma splice. D is a comma splice. If you missed that, write that down. And B is wrong because we have our fan boys, but we're missing a comma, so it creates a run-on. But I'm assuming that if we miss this question, it's most likely that you chose answer choice A, right? Or maybe D. Because you imagined that the sentence would want a period where the comma is after the word void. You probably did not read enough to provide yourself the full context. A sounds fine if you stop at the word void. Instruments were prohibitively expensive and thus scarce in isolated villages in order to fill the void, right? So you kind of, I mean, it doesn't make a ton of sense, but I can understand thinking that sounds quote unquote fine. But again, sound is a place where we can start with these grammar questions, but it's not the final place we want to be. Why do we know it has to be C? Because we have two independent clauses, and those two independent clauses can be connected in only a couple of options, with a couple of options. And the only option we are given in our answer choices for 7 is C, right? Separating two independent clauses of the period. So really focus on making sure you're applying a really robust strategy for a question like this. Okay, so I secretly love question 8, and if you missed question 8, sorry, but this is a really good example of why we need to actually have rules as opposed to like fake rules, right? Why we actually care about the rules of grammar and the approach of grammar and writing as opposed to little tips and tricks, quote unquote, that other test prep companies seem to be obsessed with. So I know I've heard students tell me that whenever they see something like this, which answer choice is least redundant in context, they have a habit of just choosing whichever answer choice is shortest. However, this isn't good enough in this case. Why? Well, because them or one or itself, we don't know what that subject, what that pronoun is actually referring to. Um, so could this pronoun be referring to groups? Yes, it could be. Could the pronoun them be referring to Celtic people? Yes, right? Could one, we don't know what these pronouns refer to of them, itself, and one. These are what we call ambiguous pronouns. So all of those are shortest, but the only one that is best is this musical form. It's the only answer choice which actually reveals what our actual subject is, which is Celtic mouth music. So don't always just go to the shortest. Sometimes it actually requires a little bit more thought than that. All right, so question 9, which choice is clearest and most precise in context? Okay, I'm just going to show you what's wrong in the other answer choices than the correct one. So with is what's wrong in A. We can't have with there. Exposing with audiences means that the audiences and the Cranberries and Mouth Music are all exposing things together. Doesn't make sense. C suggests that the audience are exposing Celtic Mouth Music, which doesn't make any sense either. And then D is another issue because worldwide exposing Celtic mouth music suggests that Celtic mouth music is exposing rather than the music is being exposed. It suggests that Celtic mouth music is doing the exposing itself, right? So B is best because we want it to say that the success of bands such as the Cranberries revealed or demonstrated or exposed audiences worldwide to Celtic mouth music. All right, so this is ultimately a question about modifier placement. If you missed this, review some of our notes and videos and etc. Talk to your tutor about modifier placement for question 9. All right, if you missed question 10, I presume you fell into a classic ACT trap, which is you chose an answer choice that sounds the best to your ears on this passage, but you didn't actually answer the question stem asked of you, right? What does the question stem ask explicitly? It asks that they incorporate both Celtic music and current influences. So does B mention Celtic music or current influences? No, it just says new music and new albums. C, do we get a reference to current music and Celtic influences? No. D, no, right? B, C, and D all sound perfectly fine, but they don't answer the question being asked of us. So, two things I think we might have done if you missed this, right? You might have just said, oh, I'm on the ACT, let me just choose the shortest answer. It's usually right. That might be true in certain instances, but that's not always the case. Or maybe you thought to yourself, I'm going to choose an answer choice that sounds the best to me or focuses on what I think matters the most. When really we are being asked a very, very specific question that A is the only answer choice that addresses that question, right? Which is only addressed by answer choice A. So with that, we get through our first passage and we can move on to the next ones. So question 11 is a great example of what I would call a presumed or false non-essential phrase, in which It kind of looks and seems and sounds like a situation when you would use in a non-essential phrase. You'd put a pair of commas around something, but it really isn't. Okay, so if you missed this question, I assume that you fell for that kind of trap. No, why? Okay, a lot of times when we see a name like the Garamantes, we think, okay, this is explaining something that came before it. We put it within a pair of commas, we move on, right? The same way you'd say something like, my English teacher, comma, Rio, comma, told me I should study vocab and study grammar. However, in this case, this cannot be a non-essential phrase because it's essential to the sentence. How do we know? More than 2,000 years ago, a people, the Romans, created a complex civilization in one of the desert's driest places, right? For one, a people, the Romans, can't be a subject, right? That would be the subject of the sentence if we took out called the Garamantes. So that's one reason why it can't work. The second reason it can't work is because um, it would suggest that the Romans created this complex civilization, but it wasn't the Romans who did. It was the Garamantes who did. All right, so a people who the Romans called, or well, we don't have the who, a people the Romans called the Garamantes is our subject here. This whole thing is our subject, right? Because we might not know the name that the Garamantes gave to themselves. So that is why D has to be correct. You cannot put a comma in your subject if that whole thing is the subject. C, remember, when we have a colon, that means it's functioning as an elaboration. Everything before the elaboration has to be a complete sentence, which we don't have here. And then B, this comma is totally unnecessary. It's, again, splitting up our subject from our verb unnecessarily. This is all just one long clause. So, and we already described why A is wrong, so that's how we arrive to D for 11. If you missed this, remember to double check if a thing actually is non-essential rather than whether it just kind of superficially resembles what we typically see as a non-essential phrase. Okay, so 12 is actually, even though it says least redundant, this in context is important, right? So we don't want to fall into the trap of just thinking anytime it says which is least redundant, we just choose the shortest answer choice, right? We have to make sure that we're not eliminating anything that we need to be in the sentence. So why is D, our shortest answer choice, wrong? Well, because in that, then they'd say they built towns and villages, cloth and jewelry, and traded throughout the North Africa and Mediterranean, right? They didn't build cloth and jewelry, right? Cloth and jewelry can be its own element in the list. We need to know what verb they did. So really what 12 is actually asking us about, write this down if you don't understand it, parallel structure. 12 is asking us about parallel structure. So we have a verb in the past tense. They built. We have a verb in the past tense. They traded. So what else did they do? They did a verb in the past tense. They manufactured. So they manufactured cloth and jewelry. They built towns and villages, and they traded. So we want to have them all in the same past tense verb before the thing that they did. And D is too short in that we lose the verb for that item in the list. All right, I'm a little zoomed out here for 13 because we're on different pages, but check this out here. So if the writer were to delete the preceding, that means the sentence that comes before sentence, the paragraph would primarily lose a concluding statement that does something, right? So this paragraph does a list of all of the ways in which the Garamantes created a complex civilization in one of the driest, most inhospitable places in the world. What included that? They built towns, they manufactured cloth, they traded, and they grew a variety of crops, including wheat, dates, palms, figs, grapes, figs, and melons. I read figs twice, whoops. All right. So, now, what would we lose if we got rid of that? Well, we would get rid of anything that suggests how they managed to survive there, right? A is perfect, right? It is a suggestion that, look, they were successful farmers in the driest or one of the driest places in the world because look at how many different things they're able to grow. All right. B, it doesn't summarize the information presented because we're not summarizing everything that came before. We're not talking about the dryness. We're not talking about the cloth. We're not talking about the towns they built, nothing like that. C is a bit of a jump, right? They don't say they traded these crops to the Romans. We don't even know if the Romans were around there. And finally, D doesn't make any sense. So we're left with A for 13. If you missed this, I'm assuming maybe you chose something like B or C, reading either too deeply or making a baggage distractor, when really the only thing that this is accomplishing is showing, look at how much they were able to grow in one of the driest places on Earth. All right, 14. If you missed this, you just didn't read the question stem, right? Because all of these answer choices make sense in context, right? All A through D makes sense in context. But which one indicates the method used? Only one talks about the method. A. Is underground a method of digging tunnels? No. Is dimly lit a method of digging tunnels? No. Is a desert tunnel the method of digging tunnels? No. The only one that talks about the method is hand dug. If you missed a question like 14, you're certainly moving far too fast. You should not miss a question like this. Make sure you read the question stems before you answer a question. All right, so question 15 plays into a thing that a lot of Americans fall into, which is this could of, should of. But remember, those are could have or should have. So of, no good. Had to of relied, I mean, had to have relied. Okay, so neither of those are good because of the of. Just a thing to know. Okay, now why is relies no good? If you chose relies, think to yourself, are the Garamantes somebody that's around today or hundreds to thousands of years ago? It's thousands of years ago, right? So could rely puts us in the past tense like we want, and it doesn't make the classic mistake of could of, should of when we really want have. So that's how we arrive to C for 15. All right, so 16, we want to have a proper transition. So what kind of category of transition do we want here? We want to build on what's coming before, right? Because we're showing how these canals allow for water to be, all the benefits of these canals, right? So what are some benefits? They stay clean and don't evaporate, right? They're unaffected by drought, which is another benefit. We have a constant supply, which is another benefit. And then another benefit is the cold, damp air of these canals lowered the temperature in the homes built above them as an ancient form of air conditioning. So we want a transition that says something more, right? Moreover is that transition. Okay, moreover does that. Nevertheless is a kind of concession pivot. We're not pivoting, we're building on it. In contrast, does the same thing. Then even so, it's kind of a pivot that also concedes. So B, C, and D all sort of do the same thing, whereas A actually, as moreover, builds on what comes before, which is what it kind of transition we're looking for exactly. All right, so for 17, if you chose A, the Garamantes who thrived until about 500 CE would suggest that this is a dependent clause, but it isn't a dependent clause. It's an independent clause. We need an independent clause here. The Garamantes thrived until about 500 Common Era, right? B would be a non-essential phrase, but there's no comma there to make it a non-essential phrase. And also, it cannot be a non-essential phrase there because we couldn't say the Garamantes when some archaeologists. And then C makes this a non-essential phrase, which we cannot have. It needs to be an essential phrase. So the only answer choice which works is to get rid of it. We just would want to say the Garamantes thrived until about 500 CE, right? Because that is what makes it a independent clause, which is what we want here. So independent clause for 17 is how we arrive to D. Okay, 18 is a more straightforward question than you might have expected if you missed this one, okay? If you missed this one, you might have thought, ooh, I want to use a fancy word like whereas, right? Which ultimately doesn't actually produce anything positive for our text. So simply put, we have a comparison, right? We have as then statement. As the blank, then the blank. Okay. Um, so as the Fogueras supplied less and less water, the population declined, and then it eventually collapsed, right? So um, this is a pretty straightforward one, actually, as to why it's A. It's just the proper transition to create that natural comparison, that natural as then statement. Um, as to when means like it naturally suggests that the following is going to say we don't know, right? Or it happened then. It gives a date, but we don't get a date. Whereas is not the right kind of comparison here. It's a fancy sounding word, but it means a pivot or a contrasting situation. As does though. C and D function basically the same way here. So you know that you can't choose between the two of them. So that's how we arrived at A for question 18. All right, so 19 we have, so 18 kind of connects to 19. So maybe watch the 18 video to help with 19. But basically what we have here is we have several sentences that can stand on their own. As the Fogaras supplied less and less water, the Garamantes population declined. Their civilization eventually collapsed. So we know that their civilization eventually collapsed is surely a independent clause. So we need to reveal it as an independent clause, right? What can we use to show something as an independent clause? We can't use just a comma, right? What we could use is a semicolon. We could use a colon, since this could be an elaboration, or we could use a comma and a fanboys. A is wrong because we have just the comma, so that's a comma splice. B would be just bizarre, okay? Redundant and a run-on and many things. And then D is a run-on as well. So the only one that actually effectively separates these two independent clauses or these two things that can stand on their own as a complete sentence is answer choice C, which is why we choose it. So question 20 is kind of nice because typically when we see these least redundant in context questions, we're in a rush to just choose the shortest answer choice. And that oftentimes leads us to bad places. Without really thinking critically, we choose an answer choice that is just short, but doesn't actually accomplish what the sentence requires based on the context. But here, as it turns out, the shortest is certainly the best, right? Why? Well, the stone mounds that mark their ventilation shafts, right? The ventilation shafts of these Fogaras are still visible in what is now southwestern Libya, where they can still be seen. Okay, so we know that they're still visible because of earlier on in the sentence. So we certainly don't need to say that where they can be seen. We know they're still visible from earlier on in the sentence for B as well. So we don't need to say where visitors can still see these amazing signs. And C does the same thing. A, B, and C all make a redundant note of the fact that they are still visible, which is something that we already have right here. Okay, so remember, redundancy is when we state something that we've already stated before. And we just want to get rid of anything that we don't need in the sentence that doesn't contribute to the meaning of the sentence. And D doesn't contribute, or everything else doesn't contribute. So we just want to do D, get rid of everything, right? So that's why we arrive to D for this and finish our second passage of the English side of this ACT 498. All right, so question 21 is asking which is clearest and most precise in context. Very often, this is also asking us to consider the three things that are paramount for both the SAT and the ACT: concision, precision, and clarity. All right, so we want all three of those aspects there, meaning which says it in the most efficient way, while also saying it in the clearest way, also saying it in the most precise way. So the answer choice which does all of that is in fact D, to delete the underlined portion. Why? Well, we already have this word descend right here. Everything coming here that talks about going down is just a synonym to descend that we don't need, right? Down below, why do we need that? Isn't that already even more redundant than just down? Downwards, redundant. So because we have this word descend, we know that 21 is going to be D in this instance. So that's how we arrive to D for 21. So if you missed question 22, I'd like you to write down for yourself that this is a non-essential phrase question. Okay, non-essential phrases are bits of language or information that are embedded with a sentence that don't need to be there. So for this one, it's less so that you probably didn't notice that it was a non-essential phrase, but rather that you don't know how to construct non-essential phrases. So what can we use to produce a non-essential phrase? We can use a pair of commas, a pair of dashes, or a pair of parentheses. Okay, so what do we have here? We have a pair of dashes. We already have one dash here. That means that when we start our non-essential phrase, which is a veritable shockwave of photonic energy, we're going to need to use the same type of punctuation. So we want to use a dash to begin and end this non-essential phrase. And we know it's a non-essential phrase because the sentence works on its own without it. This radiation is emitted when subatomic particles called neutrinos collide with electrons in the molecules of ice. That's everything we need. So that's how we arrive to B for question 22. Question 23 is ultimately asking us, what does this non-essential phrase do? All right, so we know it's a non-essential phrase because it's within a pair of parentheses, which means that the structure of this sentence is able to stand without it. Okay, so structurally the sentence can exist without it. But if we were to get rid of the underlined portion, what would happen? Okay, well, what would we lose? Well, what does this underlined portion do? Or in your case, if you're taking it online, it'll probably say highlighted portion. What does it do? Well, it just says, look at how many there are. They're everywhere. There's 50 trillion neutrinos that pass through your body every second. Oh my God, right? So D is correct for that reason. Okay, a lot of these answer choices that are wrong is how I would get to the correct answer, just looking at what's wrong. For example, why they are practically weightless. Do we get a why? No. Is there any sort of specification? No. That's how we get rid of that. For B, it explains how neutrinos pass through matter, right? Do we explain how this happens? No. It does suggest that they pass through matter, sure. But do we get an explanation of how they manage to do this? Not at all. And then finally, C, do we get an answer as to why there are so many neutrinos? No, we just know that there are so many. So there's something wrong with all of our wrong answer choices. And there's nothing wrong with D because it really does, say it does emphasize how many there are. So D for 23, that non-essential phrase is perfect. And it means that there's a lot of neutrinos. Okay, so question 24 is asking us, how do we produce the punctuation for this transition? Okay, so however is functioning as a transitional adverb, right? So how do we identify it here? Okay, so um, how do we do this? So ultimately, because however is coming embedded within an independent clause, right? It's not coming at the beginning or the end of an independent clause. We need to put it within a pair of commas, just like we do in B. Okay. We can't go with C. We can't go with A, because in both of those instances, the other sides of the semicolons need to be complete sentences. Is on some occasions a complete sentence in A? No, nor is it in C. So that's why you get rid of A and C. And then finally with D, however, or transitional adverbs as such, need to be surrounded by punctuation, whether it be a period and a comma, a semicolon and a comma, or a pair of commas. We need that kind of punctuation, depending on where it is in the sentence, determines what kind of punctuation, but we use a pair because it is not a subordinating clause or a subordinating conjunction, excuse me. So with that, we arrive to B, where we put it within a pair of commas, because that's what we do with transitions. So B for 24. So for a question like 25, when we are considering adding or deleting a sentence, we need to put ourselves in the thought of, does this sentence align with the subject of the paragraph itself. So we're not being asked, does this sentence belong in the passage, typically? Instead, we're being asked, does this sentence belong in this specific place, which usually has to do with the paragraph itself, right? So what is the topic of this paragraph? What is the main idea of this paragraph? Well, about where we can get neutrinos to collide with other particles, right? So we used this whole situation here in order to help make sense of neutrinos colliding with other particles, right? So it is hard to detect this anywhere other than at the IceCube neutrino factory or observatory, okay? So the sentence that we're being asked to consider in 1956 during the Cohen-Raines neutrino experiment, a neutrino was detected for the first time. That's certainly an interesting aspect, and it certainly relates to the passage as a whole. I think that this sentence could exist somewhere in this passage. But does it make sense in this particular paragraph that talks about why the IceCube Neutrino Observatory is a really good place to see neutrinos colliding with other particles? No. All right. So that's why we want to choose no, which is exactly what C does. So that's why we roll with it. Okay, so question 26 is a pretty straightforward question. We're asked to make the passage grammatically acceptable. Which one does it? The sentence grammatically acceptable, which one does it? So basically, options B, C, and D are all interchangeable. Okay, so there's no instance in which we could use B and not D or C and not D. Okay, they're interchangeable in their construction. Now, beyond that, we have the issue of, so that's why we know that B, C, and D can't work, but in principle, why are they not able to work? Because we don't have two independent clauses on either side of this position, right? To facilitate the detection of such a collision is not an independent clause. Therefore, we can't separate it using any of the tactics in B, C, or D. So we arrive to A as our correct answer. So question 27 is asking about the tense of a verb. Okay, we need to understand whether it's in the present or the past, and we also need to understand whether it is singular or plural. Okay, so in this case, all of the answer choices that are incorrect are all plural. Have, are, and are. However, the subject of this sentence for which this verb is conjugated is singular. Why? The origin is uh, our subject here, right? So the origin of each of these neutrinos, okay? So the origin is singular, right? And it's referring to one neutrino at a time because we use that word each. So because origin is singular, that means we need to choose a singular conjugation of the verb, and B, C, and D are all plural. So that is how we arrive to A for question 27. All right, so question 28 asks, which of the following sentences best introduces the main idea of the paragraph? So this is a more straightforward way of asking basically the same question of 25, which is, what goes on in this paragraph? It's ultimately more of a reading question than anything. So what does this paragraph talk about? Well, it talks about all the ways in which neutrinos and the origins of neutrinos could reveal information about the universe, right? So it could reveal information about supernova. It could reveal information about star collapse. It could give information ultimately into looking at our galaxy, okay, and galaxies beyond. So the correct answer choice is going to be one which says that neutrinos talk about all the ways in which, or figuring out the origin of neutrinos, excuse me, provide all of these possible insights. So obviously A does that. Okay, A does exactly what we want here. Now, these other answer choices are incorrect because they don't focus specifically on what happens in this paragraph. right? Any of these could exist and be factual, but it's not about whether they sound good or whether they look good or whether they convey something important. It's about whether they deal with the same notion of the paragraph as a whole. So gamma ray is not in that paragraph, right? Bert and Ernie are not in that paragraph. Um, the creation of neutrinos in laboratory is not in that paragraph. All of these things don't have anything to do with why figuring out the origin of neutrinos is interesting. So that's why we arrived to A for question 28. All right, so question 29 is asking a little bit about how do we navigate non-essential phrases within the context of a sentence, especially when the sentence is ending. Okay, so it is perfectly valid to put a period after a parentheses when that parentheses pair, the parenthesis, ultimately singular, is coming in the form of a non-essential phrase, which is what we see here. We have a non-essential phrase, the collapsing of stars, within a pair of parentheses, and we can put a period after those parentheses. So, why do we know that we want a period? Because to the left and to the right of the period are both clauses which can be and should be their own complete sentence. Other things we could put in place of that period include a semicolon, probably, right? Or a comma and a fanboys. However, we don't get those options anywhere else in this answer choice, right? B is missing our comma, C is missing a fanboys, and D is ultimately creating a run-on without having any punctuation there. So I presume if you missed 29, it was out of a certain nervousness at the idea of, I have a two punctuation marks in a row right next to each other. Is that allowed? It is allowed with a parenthesis, right? A pair within the pair of parentheses, if we're finishing a non-essential phrase right before the end of a clause. So perfectly all good for 29 to be A. These other ones create different errors, new errors. All right, so if you missed question 30, I presume it's because you went with whatever you thought sounded the most interesting or felt was the most valuable way to end the paragraph or the passage as a whole. But we need to make sure we are answering the question stem. We're only doing what's asked of us. So we want to emphasize that it could have dramatic effects on the study of the universe. So our galaxy and galaxies beyond ultimately does refer to the universe, okay? If I were an editor myself, I'd probably just turn our galaxy and the galaxies beyond into the universe, right? I think you can be more precise and concise than saying our galaxy and galaxies beyond. But the issue with these other answer choices is that they don't refer whatsoever to the universe as a whole, right? Phenomena that puzzled scientists could be about the universe, or it could be about the micro scale. Nothing suggests specifically that we're talking about the universe as a whole, right? Space doesn't talk about the universe either, right? And then finally, the world around us is too small. So all of these other references don't go to the magnitude of the universe that our question stem requests of us. So that's how we ultimately arrive at A for question 30. And with that, we end our third passage and move on to the next one. All right. So question 31 is asking us which is most clear and precise in context. Ultimately, we're trying to figure out the difference between who, whom, and which. So first things first, we want to get rid of which, because we're talking about a person here, Clinton Hill. And sorry, Clinton Hill is not a person. That's not a person, excuse me. We're talking about the person Raphael Leonardo Black, right? So we can't use which here because we're talking about a person, right? So when we talk about any people, we always are going to use the who, whom situation. So of whom also doesn't make sense here because of whom maybe someone had just heard about or something. But so now we are between who versus whom. So what is the difference between who versus whom? So one of the easy ways to think about this is to think about it in the context of a different pronoun, right? So kind of the like cheating way to think about it is if we would use he, she, or they, we use who. If we would use him, her, or them, we would use whom, right? The easy way to remember that is the M in whom is like the M in him or the M in them, right? Now, why? Let's explain that more directly. Okay. We use who as a subject. All right. So when a verb has the subject has a pronoun as a subject, it's in be who, right? So our verb here is had just been discovered, right? That's the kind of um, uh, I want to say predicate, right? That's our predicate, right? So that means this is our subject, right? So because it's a subject, we're going to go with a, no change, right? He had just been discovered is a way to think about that, right? We would use whom if it is the object of a verb, okay? Um, so instead of saying who had just been discovered, um, maybe we would have said something along the lines of, right, um, about whom many have just recently heard, right? That would be a really weird way to say that, but that grammatically works because ultimately we are making uh, the many other people the subject and the whom is the object of that. So that's how we get to who here. It is the subject. We use who. All right, so 32 is a tricky one here because it immediately looks like we have a non-essential phrase. And a non-essential phrase we always want to make sure has the same pair of punctuation around it. So we might naturally think that A must be the correct answer. But it turns out that 10 of Black's pieces sold for is not a non-essential phrase. Why? Try to remove it from the sentence. Within days, prices ranging from 1,600 or 16,000 to 28,000. Does that make any sense? Within days, prices ranging from 16,000 to 28,000. No, that makes no sense whatsoever. All right. So this cannot be, as it turns out, a non-essential phrase. So what is going on here? Well, actually what we have is we have a sentence, which is from here to here. Within days, 10 of Black's pieces sold. Okay. Sorry, I put that in the wrong spot. Sold. So within days, 10 of Black's pieces sold is our sentence. After that, we have what's called an elaboration for prices ranging from 16,000 to 28,000. Why is that an elaboration? Because we don't need it for the sentence, but it does clarify something that comes previous in the sentence. So how do we create elaborations? We can use a dash or a colon, which is why B is correct. It uses a dash to create that elaboration. C is wrong because on either side of the semicolon, we would need a complete sentence. But is for prices ranging from blah to blah a complete sentence? No. And then finally, D, really tricky, right? We might be thinking, oh, I know I can use a colon for an elaboration, and I have elaboration here. But that elaboration has to begin after the word sold. Remember, everything before an elaboration must be a complete sentence. And is this a complete sentence? Within days, 10 of Black's pieces sold for? No, it's not, right? So on that basis, we can get rid of C and D. If you chose A, you just were moving too quickly and just saw something that looked like it could be a non-essential phrase, probably without checking whether it actually was one. And then B does the right job of creating an elaboration in the right place using the right punctuation, which in this case is offered as a dash. Though if it was in the right place, we could have also used a colon. All right, so 33, we have two independent clauses here. How do we know? Our subject in the first clause is the artist himself, Black. And the clause in the second clause is defined by the subject of the collages, right? The collages are packed with depictions in the form of drawings of ancient myths, blah, 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 right? Um, so that means we have two independent clauses because we have two subjects. And that means we can use one of a couple of options, right? We can use a semicolon, we can use a comma and a fanboys, or we can use a period. So, what is wrong with some of these answer choices that are wrong? A, what's missing? The comma. C, what's missing? The fanboys. D, what's missing? Everything. So, B is the only one which fulfills what we need to separate two independent clauses using a period. So that's how we arrive to B for 33. All right, so 34 is ultimately a redundancy question. So why do we not need this in the form of drawings here? Well, because we already know that Black is drawing these collages because we use the word draws right up there. So because we're already saying that they are drawings, why would we need to say that they are drawings in all of these answer choices? We wouldn't. So remember, grammatically, we always want to be as precise and concise as possible. We don't want to be redundant. So D is our best option because it's the only one that doesn't mention drawings when we already know that he drew these collages. So that's how we arrive to D for 34. All right, so if you missed 35, you made a very classic mistake here. I think this is going to be one of the most missed questions we'll see on an ACT, while also being one of the more straightforward ones. Okay. I would say that this is a classic example of something we see in the SAT and the ACT as well, which is a question that is not hard, but is really easy to miss. So what do I mean by that? Well, when we realize what's going on, we have a phrase here, a portrayal of Danish surrealist painter William Freddy at work. We realize, okay, of course, William Freddy is an essential part of this phrase, right? Because it's part of the subject of that phrase. Everywhere else, we see the name of the person included as a subject, right? So Wilhelm Freddy cannot be a non-essential phrase. However, it's really common for us to see a name like Wilhelm Freddy after a title like Danish surrealist painter and think that it's a non-essential phrase. It's very common for that to be the case. For example, a sentence like, my teacher, comma, Rio, comma, really wants me to study grammar and vocab. So finding that is really important. So we see that and it's all good, right? So now identifying that Wilhelm Freddy is not a non-essential phrase, I think is pretty easy, but I think if we're on autopilot trying to get through this test as quickly as we can, it's natural to run into an issue where we select A because it looks like what we are expecting and it doesn't actually accomplish the task that we need. So we can't have a comma anywhere else either, like here or here, because in that case, we're disrupting an item in a list, which can't have any commas. Otherwise, we would need to use semicolons to separate all the other items in a list, which is actually another reason why we cannot use answer choice A either. So for all those reasons, we have to choose answer choice D, which again, I think makes a lot of sense once you read the sentence as a whole. But when we're moving quickly, we might select an answer choice that just looks like what we typically do, even if it isn't actually in line with the principles of grammar. So the question here is not asking us about like basically we really are just being asked to identify what is going on in this underlined portion, right? It's not asking us whether we should or shouldn't delete this underlined or in your case highlighted portion. Rather, we're just being asked, what is this basically? So basically what we see here is that the author is saying that they really appreciate what goes on in this work, even if it doesn't quite make sense to them. All right. So is there this he or she is glad that Black has been discovered part in this particular quote? No. Right. Is this revealing a narrator's belief that the artist can only understand what their art means? No. And then A, is there an argument here? Is there an argument about Naumann? No. right? So those are the reasons why A, C, and D are wrong. And then B doesn't that nicely describe what's going on here. It gives detail as to, or reveals basically that the narrator likes this collage, even if they didn't really know exactly what's going on in it. It was cool. It gave them an opportunity to think about it. So that's where we have to be. All right, so this in May for question 27, which is going to be highlighted on the online version or underlined in the paper version, is needing to find a place. So it needs to come. So when was such a stir created? It was created in May. May is referring all the way back to up here when uh, in May of 2013, an art dealer directed uh, or revealed this art in a solo show, right? So back in May of 2013, that is what this May refers to. Anywhere else, it suggests it's just the month doesn't clarify what it is, right? May is being modified by creating such a stir, right? So that's what happens in the month of May. So that's why D is our correct answer for 37. The 38 is asking for the most effective transition from the preceding sentence to this sentence. Let's take a look at it. Given that so basically we need to know what is going on in the sentence. We see I'll keep checking the times for word of his next show. Okay, so it's going to have to do something with his show. And the sentence before says that he's always been an artist regardless of who knew it. Right? So why does C work best? So now that I know him there lines up with this regardless of who knew it. Right? So if you read the previous sentence that Black gave little thought to the sudden interest, well, our narrator now has an interest and now knows about this artist, though this artist said he's always been an artist, regardless of who knew it. But now that the narrator knows about this artist, they're going to just keep an eye out to see the next show, right? Knowledgeable about art and books and knowing that I like news, all of these things don't align whatsoever to the content of the paragraph as a whole or the sentence before and after that we're navigating. So that's why we're up to C for question 38. All right, so 39 is, I think, a great example of a question that is not actually all that hard, but is easy to miss if we're not paying attention. A lot of times we think, ooh, when we have a name, we can put it in a pair of commas to make it a non-essential phrase, but in fact, we actually can't. Why? Because Black is essential here. So the only answer choice which does that correctly is B. D is wrong because everything before building is not a complete sentence, which we always would need before colon. And then C, we don't need that comma whatsoever, so that is a comma splice. So that's where we have to B for question 39. So question 40, a question like this on the ACT will always have a keyword that reveals where our sentence needs to be. So here we see the web page, right? That identifies all these things. So web page is the trigger word that's going to reveal where it needs to be. The reason why C works great is because web page aligns with right here, 7 lamps in a quick online search. And then we know that this sentence talks about the people, places, and events that are in these collages, which we are revealed afterwards in the sentence after where this sentence is being placed. So that's why it belongs where it does. These other answer choices don't make sense because for paragraphs 1 and 2, in those points, they aren't referring to a web page anywhere near there. So we can't put a sentence there talking about a web page. And then finally, point D in paragraph 4, again, we're not talking about a web page here, nor are we talking about the artists that are present in his collages like we're doing here. I'm assuming if you missed question 40, it had more to do with running out of time or being pressed for time or not wanting to spend as much time as we needed on a question like this. in which case speeding up overall is going to make a question like 40 actually probably an easy question, even if the form of it and the content of it is relatively difficult under time constraints. Okay, so 41 is asking about punctuation, grammatically acceptableness. As of right now, with the no change option, we're creating a non-essential phrase that is in fact essential. So in many urban areas, they're considered little more than something in specific. Okay, so we do need this comma here, all right? But oh, I'm giving away the answer to 42 right now, but we need that comma there. But the reason why we don't want the comma beginning this is because it turns rats with wings into a non-essential phrase, which we can't have, right? B tries to create a non-essential phrase, but in the wrong way. And then C says that in many urban areas, they're considered little more than, considers that to be an independent clause, right? We can only have, if we use a semicolon, either side of the semicolon must be an independent clause, aka able to stand on its own as a sentence, which doesn't make sense there either. So why do we want D? Well, there's no need for any punctuation here. The first punctuation we'd want is all the way at the end of wings. So for this case, we just want nothing. So we would go with D for question 41. All right, so 42, we have an independent clause connected to a dependent clause. So blamed for spreading disease and despoiling statues is connected to that sentence beforehand. We're going to connect it with just a comma, like we see in answer choice A. So that's why we want to make it no change. What's wrong with some of these other ones? We have an issue with C because ultimately they are blamed for spreading disease and despoiling statues, turns this into a independent clause. And with an independent clause, we cannot connect it with just a comma, so that is no good. B goes with no comma at all, which would make it ultimately a run-on sentence, especially with this word and, right? And then D is no good because it suggests that blamed for disease and despoiling statues is an independent clause when it actually isn't. So that's how we get to A, question 42. So for 43, we need to know what transition are we using when we look between the information surrounding it. So the sentences before talk about how pigeons have a poor reputation and are considered, rats with wings. But then this next sentence says, in actuality, homing pigeons are among the best navigators of the natural world. So, and they also have an undeniable place in history. So it would make sense for our transition here to pivot away from this poor reputation into a good one. So which of our answer choices is a pivot? However, for example, would be wrong because it would say that this, the homing pigeon being a good navigator, is an example of them spreading disease and being like rats. That doesn't make sense. Similarly, does basically the same thing, and that also wouldn't make sense. And then thus would be cause and effect, which suggests that them being good navigators is a consequence of them having a poor reputation, which makes no sense. So we only want to pivot, and the pivot is best represented by C, however. Okay, so for 44, you'll notice the highlighted portion just runs from the word pigeon to which. Okay, so what is going to make this sentence okay? So first off, we need the homing pigeon to be within a non-essential phrase because the sentence is able to function structurally as just one species is among the best navigators of the natural world. All right, so we need to make sure we have a comma both or after the word pigeon. So that's going to eliminate answer choices B and D. Now, between A and C, this which is unnecessary and also violates the sentence, which is usually or almost always used as a non-essential phrase. Whereas here, it is actually essential. We are just trying to say that one species is among the best navigators of the natural world. So that is why we go with C, because as the comma that finishes the non-essential phrase and gets rid of that which we do not need. Okay, so for 45, why do we want to make this change? Okay, so we know that we want A. Let's talk about why. Okay, so depending on their location is ultimately vague. All right, they face challenges in communicating depending on their location. Uh, suggests that, it suggests nothing, right? In fact, we probably would want to just eliminate that sentence if it were written as such, right? So to edit this to saying, especially across long distances and difficult terrain, we now understand why there are challenges in communicating specifically. Okay. B is wrong, even though it says yes, because does it clearly identify the location and distances between troops? No, there's no clear identification. C, it is certainly relevant because it specifies why it is a challenge in communication. Remember, this isn't about deleting this underlined or highlighted portion. It's about editing it, which is important. And finally, D, um, does it suggest that they are unnecessary today? No, because again, remember, this isn't deleting this portion. It's about revising it. So if you missed this question, maybe you misread the question step and thought it was just asking you to delete something, or perhaps something else happened at play, but that's why we want to choose A and why B, C, and D are all wrong. Okay, so for 46, we're asked to choose the least redundant choice. A lot of times we want to rush to the answer choice that is the shortest, and many times it is in fact the shortest answer choice that is correct. Now, in this case, that's what we have. Okay, why? So returned means to come back. So if we already have returned, we don't need come back. And then finally, if we have home roost, we don't need home in an answer choice. So we can get rid of C and we can get rid of B. So for A, coming back is redundant with returned. And for B and C, home is redundant with home roost. D says everything we need, just saying that they returned to their home roost. All right, so for question 47, we're ultimately being asked about a modifier question. We want to make sure that our subject is cher ami, meaning dear friend, right? So one of 600 birds used by the US Signal Corps in France. So right after this comma, we need to have our subject of the sentence, which is in this case, cher ami. So according to A, no change, the missions are one of 600 birds. Were the 12 missions one of the 600 birds? No, cher ami is. B, same issue, right? 12 missions are the 600 birds. Same with C, right? So the only answer choice which makes cher ami our subject that aligns with the fact that cher ami was one of 600 birds. D is the only answer that does that, so that's why we have to choose it, right? So remember, with modifiers, you have to have your subject next to the thing it is being modified by or the thing it is modified. So for 48, what we have here is an elaboration. When we have an elaboration, we can always use either a colon or a dash, which is why B is correct. So remember, with an elaboration, everything that comes before the punctuation needs to be a complete sentence, which is what we have. They had but one link to headquarters as a complete sentence. However, what comes after doesn't need to be a complete sentence. So C is wrong because homing pigeons is not a complete sentence. D creates a comma splice. If we're going to use a comma to create something of an elaborative phrase, we need some sort of language like such as or which is or something like that there, which we don't have. If we're going to use just a strict elaboration, we're going to use a colon or a dash. And then A is a run-on because we suddenly are bringing up the word homing pigeons after an independent clause. We can't tack it on without using our elaboration typical punctuation of a colon or a dash. So for 49, we have a way of adding something to the end of the sentence. Um, so it's not a direct elaboration in the way that 48 was. It's a little bit different here. Um, Now, why can we not choose D? D doesn't work because ultimately we have the Warcross is not a complete sentence, but we have a period. B doesn't work because it was the Warcross creates an independent clause, but we cannot connect independent clauses with just a comma, so that'd be a comma splice. And C is wrong because that makes an essential part of a sentence, but because we're using a comma here at the end of the sentence, we're suggesting it's non-essential. So that is why B, C, and D are wrong, and A is finally the one that has nothing wrong with it. So 50, our last question here, we need to make sure that we are connecting Cher Ami's story to a specific idea in the first paragraph of the essay. So when we go back to the first paragraph, it says specifically that pigeons have a poor reputation, but they actually include some of the best navigators of the natural world. So we need an answer choice that talks either about the reputation of pigeons or their ability to navigate. So B is correct, and clearly that makes sense because we're talking about their navigational skill and instinct, which aligns directly with the claim made in paragraph 1 about them being the best navigators of the natural world. When we go to C, if we were asked to reconsider the definition of pigeons, that might make sense, but because we have heroism, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't connect to the first paragraph. The uniqueness of pigeons is not a claim made in the first paragraph, nor is it that birds cannot be brave. That isn't a claim made in the first paragraph. So if you miss this question, you maybe are just choosing a sentence which you think is the most interesting or the most effective or like the most cool way of ending a story. But really, our goal is to just answer the question STEM specifically. The passage could have ended with any of these sentences, really, but if our goal is to connect with the first paragraph of the essay, B is the only one which does that in as specific of a way as requested. With that, we end the English section to test 498. If you have questions on any of the other sections, we have those videos up too. Thanks for joining me, and I will see you soon.